Broadcasting live from atop the Rocky Mountains, the crossroads of the West. You are listening to the Liberty Roundtable Radio Talk Show.
All right. Happy to have you along, my fellow Americans. Sam Bushman live on your radio. Hard-hitting news the networks refuse to use, no doubt, continues now. This is the broadcast for March 10th in the year of our Lord 2025. Hour 2 at 2. Promoting God, family, country, protecting life, liberty, and property, using the supreme law of the land, the Constitution, and the checks and balances, following the Prince of Peace, rejecting revolution unless it's Jesus' revolution. Dr. Scott Bradley was with me first hour doing a phenomenal job. Lowell Nelson, campaignforliberty.org, with me second hour. Welcome to the broadcast, sir.
My pleasure, Sam. Good to be with you again. Thank you.
So much going on, such little time. We got to rock and roll because we got a lot to cover. Suddenly, leaving NATO is on the table. Ron Paul. Now, great column. We talked about this column last week. However, there's a whole lot more as this continues to rumble, and we bring it up because this headline articulates the topic so well, Lowell.
Well, it sure does, Sam. It all started when Elon Musk replied, "I agree," to a tweet that read, "It's time to leave NATO and the UN." And so Ron Paul writes, having someone so close to the U.S. president who advocates finally extracting the U.S. from these international organizations is a significant and a very positive shift for the United States, end of quote. So, Ron Paul has for decades persuaded the United States to get out of NATO, but nobody listened, basically. Ron Paul believes
I've been helping him promote that forever, ladies and gentlemen.
That's right. As do I. NATO should have been dissolved at the end of the Cold War. Instead, it stirred up trouble.
It should have never been created, but now we digress.
Yeah, true. It stirred up enough trouble to justify its own existence, that it had stayed in existence all these years after the end of the Cold War. I mean, it sounds like any other government body, right? They stir up enough trouble to justify their existence, and then they continue on spending your money. Ron Paul writes that first, NATO involved itself in the first Gulf War, and then it decided its mission should be to bomb Serbia to smithereens in the name of human rights. He says, I agree with the late Senator Robert Taft, who argued at the time NATO was formed that we should not join the Atlantic Alliance. Well, end of quote there, yeah. So Taft was exactly right. We should never have joined that alliance. But we did, unfortunately, and Ron continues here, he says it has become much clearer these past few months just how far NATO has shifted away from U.S. interests. Even though the United States funds a whopping 70% of NATO's cost, our own allies, NATO allies, are working against the United States as President Trump attempts to pull us back from the brink of war with Russia, end of quote. Well, so, Sam, I think this is a significant statement, right? Now, NATO now works against the interests of the United States, and yet the U.S. still funds over 2/3 of NATO's costs. That's terrible. Well, a telephone call between Trump and Putin set the hair on fire among NATO member countries, and so while the U.S. and Russia diplomats were meeting in Saudi Arabia to look for a way back from war, our NATO so-called allies held their own summit in Paris to continue the failed war in Ukraine and to criticize the U.S. for working for peace. Even the Secretary General of NATO was there in Paris. And so the message coming out of Paris from NATO is very, very clear. We are pushing for more war while you in the United States are pushing for peace. But you got to keep paying the bills here at NATO, they said. Well, also over the weekend, this is not this, 2 days ago, but 9 days ago, Senator Mike Lee from Utah and Representative Thomas Massie from Kentucky, they echoed Elon Musk's sentiment. Senator Lee posted a chart showing how much money, the U.S. taxpayer money basically, goes to NATO, and he said, get us out of NATO. And Representative Massie added to Lee's comment, saying NATO is a Cold War relic that needs to be relegated to a talking kiosk at the Smithsonian.
Amen to that reality check. Good for them. The other thing that Mike Lee, Senator, and Kentucky Representative Thomas Massie, they also introduced last Wednesday legislation to abolish the Federal Reserve, and I commend them for that, too. They're doing a tremendous job. And I don't mean to derail the conversation. I'm just saying, look, if we really were to abolish the Federal Reserve, 90% of this foreign aid / warmongering would go away because there's no money for it, Lowell. And that's why I tie these two together.
Yeah, and well that you did. I know that I have written to my congressman about that very bill to get us, to audit the Fed for sure. That's H.R. 24. We talked about that. And then this new bill, which would end the Fed, right? There's an audit the Fed bill, and there's now an end the Fed bill, which is what you just mentioned. And so I need to add that to my list of things to discuss with my congressman. So, yeah,
Amen.
Absolutely. So it turns out that, President Trump, his instinct is to get, America First agenda, and we don't do that by putting NATO first. We got to get out of NATO. Let's end our support of NATO. Let's get out of that alliance and, put America first again. That's what Trump wants to do, and he needs congressional support to do that because most of these yahoos there in Congress are accepting money from the military-industrial congressional complex, and which tends to influence the way they vote on defense spending, which is really isn't defense, it's military hegemony throughout the planet.
Well, I want to bring this up in credit to Donald Trump. He said, "Hey, why are we spending $1 trillion on the military? Let's chop that in half and make it $500 billion." I support that 100%. I don't think it's enough cutting, but hey, man, it's a serious effort in the right direction. President Trump highlighted that, and I agree with him. But here's the question that I have. Okay, the failed clown leadership wants to do another CR, continuing resolution, to kick the can down the road to fund the government through September the 30th, right?
Mm-hmm.
The 99-page legislation would increase military spending by $6 billion. So if Trump wants to chop that in half, why are we sending him a bill that increases it by $6 billion? Because they're undermining Trump at every turn. That's why. I think Musk and Lee and Massie and Trump and Musk and all these people ought to get together, Steve Bannon, Sam Bushman, and we ought to absolutely educate the nation on why we got to jettison this continued military-industrial complex. It's the congressional military-industrial complex, folks. The proof is in the pudding of the funding. Trump wants to chop it in half. These clowns are sending him over a $6 billion increase. There's a disconnect here, Lowell.
Yeah, big-time disconnect, and you're exactly right. I think, who was it, FDR had these fireside chats with the nation. I think Trump ought to be doing that. He should be explaining to the American people, and he has the charisma to do this, Sam. I think there'd be at least half the nation half the country would be listening to him if he would educate us that, the way, with fireside chats or whatever he wants to call them, but just speak directly to the American people. You can put a lot of pressure on these Congress critters by doing so. I think that's something that he could do. The bully pulpit, they call it. He could talk behind that bully pulpit, get a lot of people on his side, draw more pressure on the Congress critters, and then they wouldn't be so heavily inclined to vote for these, heavy spending bills.
Well, many people are advocating for what we're talking about. It's not just us, ladies and gentlemen. And thanks to Ron Paul, thanks to Mike Lee, thanks to Elon Musk, thanks to Massie, thanks to hopefully Liberty Roundtable can be included in that group. But think about this headline from Ron Paul. Suddenly, leaving NATO is on the table, and he advocates for it. And then the next columnist writing about this general topic as well says this. Let's hope so. Laurence Vance. LouRockwell.com doubles in on this very thing. So it's kind of an answer to the question in a way, but yet more detail, Lowell.
That's right. He says this, quote, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that's NATO, was established in 1949 by the North Atlantic Treaty, known as the Washington Treaty, with 12 member countries. Well, since its founding, NATO has been enlarged 10 times and now has 32 member countries. The principle of collective defense is enshrined in Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. I'm now going to quote Article 5. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. And
I 100% disagree with that.
I know you do, as do I. But this is what the treaty says, folks. And so, I don't think I'd ever read this article of the treaty, so I thought it would be worthwhile our time to just quote it. So, attack against one is considered an attack against them all. And consequently, they agree, in other words, all these members of NATO, they agree that, quote, if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense recognized by Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith, individually and in concert with the other parties, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force, to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area.
Or really to guarantee the security of the gang. Because if you create this block and then you say you're not allowed to join, now you've got a cartel gang against anybody who is forbidden from joining, right? So everybody wants to join and be part of the gang. Is the See what we've created, folks? It's a no-win situation.
And this springboards off of the Charter of the United Nations. And so if the United Nations hadn't been around, hadn't been invented, then NATO would not have come to pass either. So you know how one bad decision just precipitates another, just one right after another, and that's bad news. So what this really means is the United States is now obligated, right, to come to the defense of countries like Albania, Estonia, Latvia, Luxembourg, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Slovenia, all of which have armed forces that number less than 10,000, and even Iceland, which doesn't even have a military. Now, aside from Iceland, how many Americans even know where these countries are, right? I mean, do you happen to know where Slovenia is? Do you know where Montenegro is?
No, I have no idea. I don't even know.
I don't know.
And I know that points to my ignorance. I freely admit it. But part of that problem is that, you know what, we believe in America and we focus on our lives and our world and our freedoms. And, we kind of let the rest of the world do their thing, too. They want to be left alone. We want to be left alone. That's fine. I don't have to know every country in the world, right?
Right. And
why do I have to know that?
Yeah, and so it's just a matter of interest, but shouldn't be a matter of necessity. And the thing I like about this column by Lawrence Vance is that he goes back to the wisdom of the founding fathers, right? And he quotes George Washington in his farewell address.
Now listen up, ladies and gentlemen, to this farewell address quote. I'm sorry to interrupt, Lowell, but I want people to really pay attention to this. Listen carefully to what you hear from the greatest general the world's ever known. Here it is.
He famously warned against permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world, end quote. He also said, quote, the great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible, end of quote. And then Thomas Jefferson comes along and he warns the very same thing, quote, I am for free commerce with all nations, political connection with none, and little or no diplomatic establishment. And I am not for linking ourselves by new treaties with the quarrels of Europe, entering that field of slaughter to preserve their balance, or joining in the confederacy of kings to war against the principles of liberty. I have used my best endeavors to keep our country uncommitted in the troubles which afflict Europe and which assail us on every side. And since this happy separation, our nation has wisely avoided entangling itself in the system of European interests, has taken no side between its rival powers, attached itself to none of its ever-changing confederacies. End of quote. So, Sam, great wisdom from the founders here. And of course, Vance concludes his column saying this: if the countries of Europe are that concerned about a non-existent Russian threat to their security, then let them band together to fund and maintain NATO. They shouldn't expect the United States to join with them. End of quote. Sam?
Brilliant quotes. Important to understand, folks. That's what, your first and third president of the United States doubling down on this thing? I don't know that they could be more clear, Lowell. And I don't know that, I don't know any way we could honor them and or protect America than being serious about their counsel. Are we going to heed their counsel is my question. I think we absolutely should. Now, he says, let's hope so. Well, I want to do more than hope so. I want to pray for it. I want to work towards it. I want to do everything I can to make that happen, ladies and gentlemen. That's really, really, really critical. What we need is an attitude adjustment, Lowell. Don't we?
That's what James Howard Kunstler believes. Another related column there at LouRockwell.com. And by the way, Sam, there were probably a dozen great columns on this NATO question. And I read through them all, but then I just picked a couple that brought out some new points that I had never stumbled onto. One of them, James Kunstler writes, quote, as Europe now flounders impotently and wrecks itself, America and Russia are motivated to avoid being snookered into an unnecessary world war over Ukraine. Mr. Zelensky is but an anachronistic artifact of the color revolutions that finally sputtered out with Joe Biden, who was himself in the vanguard of a colossal money-grubbing operation in that sad sack country. I'd also venture to predict that Zelensky will, before much longer, get removed from his position by his own generals. Ukraine will return to its long-standing status as a borderland that poses no danger to the rest of the world. America and Russia will be poised to defend what remains of Western civ from ambitious China. Mr. Trump is correct to avoid getting dragged into that. We have enough on our own agenda for repairing the damage done to ourselves the past 30 years. End of quote. So they're just highlighting, this counselor is just highlighting the fact that he thinks Zelensky's going down very soon, and Ukraine will again return to be a borderland that really we shouldn't be fighting over. So I mean, there's a lot of pragmatic solutions. There's a lot of constitutional solutions being ignored here. There's a lot of diplomatic solutions that are being ignored by those currently in power, primarily Zelensky and of course the Europeans who plotted to in Paris to continue pushing the war in Ukraine. And so now we get to a column by Paul Craig Roberts, Sam, where he answers the question, which I think this is just really an interesting observation. He was being asked, why is it that European leaders, some of whom met in Paris with NATO leadership, why in the world do they want to continue the war against Russia over Ukraine? Well, and so he writes the following, Sam. This is very interesting. He writes, quote, perhaps what is going on with Europe is that EU governments, after sending so much money and weapons to Ukraine, backed by claims that Ukraine was winning and would win, they want to be able to say that Trump sold out Ukraine in order to avoid accountability to their own populations in Europe. They can blame Trump for denying Ukraine and NATO a victory. End of quote.
Okay, and that's where the lie starts. That's where the lie starts, because the Ukraine cannot win. And the fact is, we should have never been involved in that foreign conflict in the first place. And the taxpayers of America and Europe and everywhere else have been robbed on this altar. And now they perpetuate and spin the lie and try to pin it on Donald Trump. And in my opinion, what we should do is get out of it entirely. Now, Donald wants to be the guy that resolves it. He wants to be the man on the global stage that resolves it. I think Trump should just simply say we're going to defund it. We should have never been in it in the first place. And I know a lot of people disagree with me. They're like, Sam, if we don't contain that, it's going to blow up in the whole world. Look, we've been telling you that they've been telling us that every conflict is going to just, take over the whole world if we don't get involved. It isn't true. In fact, 9 times out of 10, that lie gets us involved, and a minor skirmish could be resolved. But yet we get in the middle of it, and it magnifies and becomes the military-industrial complex. We fund both sides of it, and it never seems to end. That's why we need an attitude adjustment, Lowell. We need to basically say, hey, you know what? We don't need to be involved in these wars. We agree with General George Washington. We agree with President George Washington. We agree with President Thomas Jefferson. We agree with Taft. We agree with Ron Paul. We agree with Elon Musk. We agree with, and I can start naming all these authors, right? We agree. We've got to get out of this. Lawrence Vance writes about it. James Howard Kunstler over at Lou Rockwell again writes about it. And Paul Craig Roberts chimes in and asks a very critical question to add to this, Lowell.
Well, he's really, and that question is, why is Europe making itself irrelevant, right? I mean, and so I think he brings out a very important point. They're going to want to shift the blame for this loss of Ukraine to Trump. They don't want to take responsibility for it. It's the politicians are so devious, Sam. And they want to be able to shift the blame. They don't want to take responsibility for the failure, the so-called failure in Ukraine. They want to blame it on Trump, and so another great observation from Roberts, Paul Craig Roberts, writing there for LouRockwell.com, is this. He writes, quote, Trump sees economic growth as fed by opportunity. He sees more opportunity in business deals with Russia, India, China, and the rest of Asia and Africa than he sees in Europe. Trump understands that it was sanctions and the weaponization of the dollar that produced BRICS, and the search for an alternative for central bank reserves and international payments. To save the dollar's role as reserve currency, Washington needs to stop bullying, and Trump, like Putin, wants deals that work for everyone, not wars. In a world in which the dollar is not used as a weapon against other countries, BRICS is not necessary, end of quote. And so, Sam, I just think it's so refreshing to hear talk about voluntary exchange again, instead of compliance through coercion, which is what we've had the last 70 years, right? The U.S. hegemonically, right, has forced nations around the world with economic coercion and military coercion to go along with whatever the U.S. wanted done. And that's like enforcing liberty with a barrel of a gun. You just can't do it. You have to allow other countries to exercise their liberty. And so that's why this is so encouraging, Sam, to think about that. Wow, we actually could get out of NATO. We could stop this funding. Stop funding the United Nations. We could let countries be independent and sovereign countries again, without being the world's bully. I just thrilled to think of the possibilities in this, if this were really to happen, Sam. I sure hope it does, Sam. I pray that it does.
Amen. Couldn't agree more. And you got to ask yourself, why is Europe making itself so irrelevant in this question? I think what they're trying to do, as you wisely pointed out, hey, they're trying to say, hey, we're right on this. Trump's wrong on this. They'll never make ground doing that. My response to the Europeans, if they want to basically attack Trump, my response is, hey, we've bared the weight and the funding of this forever. Why don't we go ahead and quit funding it because we don't believe in it? You guys double down and believe in it. Why don't you guys just fund it all? And we'll jettison the United Nations. We'll jettison NATO. We'll jettison all these places, right? We'll get out of these foreign alliances. We'll basically bail. Right? Mm-hmm. Leaving NATO, leave the UN, leave everything. And let them just go ahead and run it, and we'll just sit on the sidelines and watch.
Yeah.
And we'll see how well it goes for them. Pretty soon their country will be bled dry just like we are. $36 trillion in debt, and not a plan to stop it that I can see. There's talk to stop it, but there's not a real plan in place to stop it at all. When we get back, Lowell Nelson and yours truly break it on down. Hard-hitting news at your fingertips. We stand with the Prince of Peace.
Proclaiming liberty across the land. You're listening to Liberty News Radio.
News this hour from townhall.com. I'm Rich Thomason. Ending the war in Ukraine. That will be the focus of talks planned for tomorrow. The discussions involving Secretary of State Rubio and high-ranking Ukrainian officials being hosted by the Saudis.
Marco Rubio lands in Jeddah tonight, ready to press the Ukrainians to sign President Trump's minerals deal. Mr. Zelensky is also in Saudi Arabia to meet the Crown Prince, but is not expected formally to take part in talks with the Americans, instead leaving that to his senior officials.
And that's the BBC's Tom Bateman. President Trump talking about lifting the ban on intelligence sharing with Ukraine. He is also discussing tariffs.
For years, the globalists, the big globalists, have been ripping off the United States. They've been taking money away from the United States. And all we're doing is getting some of it back. And we're going to treat our country fairly.
President on Fox News Sunday Morning Features with Maria Bartiromo. China's retaliatory tariffs on U.S. agricultural imports take effect today. Last week, Mr. Trump had hiked tariffs on a range of Chinese goods. The Supreme Court has agreed to decide whether state and local governments can enforce laws banning conversion therapy for LGBTQ plus children. That in a case out of Colorado. The justices have also heard arguments in a Tennessee case over whether state bans on treating transgender minors violate the Constitution. The FAA is investigating yesterday afternoon's fiery crash of a single-engine plane in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. The plane went down in the parking lot of a retirement community in Manheim Township. 5 people on board were hospitalized, several sent to burn centers. There were no injuries among people on the ground. Watching Wall Street this morning, stocks are sharply lower. The Dow is down 362 points, while the Nasdaq is off 464 points. More on these stories at townhall.com.
Celebrate twice as much with NordVPN's birthday deal. Get 72% off and a coupon for up to 1 year free. Visit NordVPN and discover the benefits. Secure up to 10 devices with a single account. Encrypt your online traffic. Reduce the risk of phishing, scams, and malware with NordVPN's Threat Protection Pro. Get the special birthday deal at NordVPN.com. Additional terms apply. NordVPN.
Hi, this is Rhett Rasmussen of BestHotGrill.com. We make the amazing Solaire infrared gas grills that are built to last and will consistently deliver better than restaurant grilled food. The Solaire infrared burner heats up to 1,000 degrees in just 3 minutes, even in the dead of winter. The high heat locks in the juices and flavor and grills food faster. Learn more about these fantastic USA-made grills at BestHotGrill.com. Solaire hot, fast grills at BestHotGrill.com.
The Foundation for Moral Law is a nonprofit legal foundation committed to protecting our unalienable right to publicly acknowledge God. The Foundation for Moral Law exists to restore the knowledge of God in law and government and to acknowledge and defend the truth that man is endowed with rights not by our fellow man, but by God. The Foundation maintains a twofold focus. First, litigation within state and federal courts. Second, education. Conducting seminars to teach the necessity and importance of acknowledging God in law and government. How can you help? Please make a tax-deductible contribution, allowing Foundation attorneys to continue the fight. You may also purchase various Foundation products as well at morallaw.org. Located in Montgomery, Alabama, the Foundation for Moral Law is a nonprofit, tax-exempt 501c3 founded by Judge Roy Moore. Please partner with us to achieve this important mission. morallaw.org.
Former Sheriff Richard Mack recounts in his book The Proper Role of Law Enforcement how he came to realize while working as a beat cop how wrong the all-too-common orientation of police officers is when they think of their job as being to write tickets and arrest people. Richard Mack tells of his personal transformation from by-the-number cop to Constitution-conscious defender of citizen safety and freedoms. Learn what it really means to serve and protect. Purchase your copy at CSPOA.org. That's CSPOA.org.
Do you know what is great about America? Ask an Immigrant. Ask an Immigrant is a new podcast dedicated to helping Americans, especially our youth, value, appreciate, and be grateful for the freedoms we have here in America. Join host Lydia Wallace-Nuttall as she interviews immigrants from around the world to discover their inspiring personal stories about why they came to America. To learn more about why America is the most prosperous, greatest country in the world, download the Loving Liberty app or go to lovingliberty.net.
Broadcasting live from atop the Rocky Mountains, the crossroads of the West. You are listening to the Liberty Roundtable Radio Talk Show.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Hi, this is Lowell Nelson riding shotgun with Sam Bushman, your host this morning here on Liberty Roundtable Live. We've been talking about NATO, getting out of NATO, getting the United States to exit NATO, this North Atlantic Treaty Organization that has got us into so much trouble in Europe and Russia and Asia. Now, everybody's talking about the need to get out, and along comes David Stockman, who at the whose column is posted at ronpaulinstitute.org. Now, who's David Stockman? Well, he was a congressman from Michigan in 1976. He joined the Reagan White House in 1981, and he served Reagan there as the budget director. He was one of the key architects of the Reagan Revolution, the plan to reduce taxes, cut spending, and shrink the role of government. David appears on the Tom Woods podcast fairly often, so I'm really quite familiar with him, but I rarely quote his articles or cover his articles here on Liberty Roundtable because they're so long. One reason they're so long is because they're detailed. David Stockman is a detail-oriented person. He knows the nuts and bolts of the federal budget. He knows where the cuts ought to be made. In other words, he knows where the fat is. He talks about cutting the fat, 100% of the fat, and then he talks about cutting into the flesh, where it's going to hurt, and people would begin to notice the cuts. And then he also talks about cutting into the bone, about hurting some really, social and programs and warfare programs where things would really hurt. But he's able to do that. I mean, he'd be a wonderful asset for DOJ. And so I hope that DOJ listens to him. David Stockman has a ton of answers. But I just wanted to introduce him to your audience.
And let's be clear, he also brings the historical kind of context to things as well, which gives you a broader understanding if you read what he has to say.
That's exactly right. For instance, as we've been talking about the trouble we got ourselves into in Eastern Asia, he talks about how that happened, the history behind this idea of the domino theory. If we don't stop the commies in Korea, then they're going to overrun the continent, they'll overrun the world. The same with, Korea and Vietnam. Both of those countries, war started because of this so-called domino theory, and also a misunderstanding of economics, this Keynesian economics that led to that. So there's two or three key myths and misunderstandings that led the United States, justified their entry into those wars. And, we got the same thing going on. They're trying to spin the propaganda again right now that if we don't stop, Putin from invading Ukraine, he's going to overrun Europe. Yeah, right. It's a big lie, folks, a big lie. And anyway, so David Stockman, not only does he give you the historical background and the context for the decisions that were made, and that are about to be made, but he gives you the actual numbers and explains how cuts can be made, where they can be made, and he does it in great detail. Just so I'm going to hit just a few of the highlights of this column. It's well worth reading the whole thing. It'll take you, a good 20 minutes to read the whole thing, but you'll come away with a wealth of knowledge, a wealth of information. Again,
by the way, before you get started on the numbers, this is an example where I talk about the National Taxpayers Union, our dear friend Pete Sepp and others, a great think tank. They've partnered with people like Ron Paul and Rand Paul and others who have really documented. I mean, Rand Paul just came out with how to save a bunch of money. Elon Musk. You can put all these people together in a great think tank and come back and say, hey, I don't know why we need to increase the debt ceiling, and I don't know why we need to see our resolution by the end of the week. Why can't we just cut enough to make the budget sail through, Lowell?
Yeah, exactly right, Sam. So first off, David Stockman gives 4 fundamental propositions related to getting out of NATO. Number 1, the federal budget has become a self-fueling fiscal doomsday machine. Even as
Boy, howdy, is that true? Look at the end of the week. You're going to hear all week long, by the way, propaganda about how, oh my gosh, it's going to be horrible. The government's going to shut down. You won't even be able to walk to the park anymore. It's going to be horrible. Okay, it's a lie. It isn't true. In fact, if they quit playing games and cutting things closest to the people first and cut things that are big expenditures that aren't directly related to the people, foreign aid's a great place to start. The military budget's a great place to start, and the American people wouldn't feel any of those things. In fact, if we brought a lot of our troops home, the American people might feel a whole lot more independent. Lowell?
Absolutely right. Secondly, his second proposition is that the nation's elephantine warfare state needs to be cut at least by $500 billion per year. That's $500 billion. And by the way, that's all fat. Third, the route to the end is a return to the no entangling alliance wisdom of the founders, which means bringing the empire home, closing the 750 U.S. bases abroad, scuttling much of the U.S. Navy and Army, and withdrawing from NATO and similar less commitments elsewhere.
By the way, let's be clear, we're not even supposed to have a standing army for more than 2 years. Go look at your Constitution, people, if you don't believe me.
You're absolutely right, Sam. And lastly, last proposition here, jettisoning NATO requires debunking its origin story and the false claim that it brought peace and security to post-war America, when what it actually did was transform Washington into the war capital of the world, dominated by a panoptic complex of arms merchants, neocon warmongers, and a vast warfare state nomenclatura.
Under the lie of promoting peace, Lowell.
Yeah, it's all a big, big lie. So, so let's get into the numbers here. He says on the eve of World War I, these are interesting figures, by the way. On the eve of World War I, the U.S. military budget was just $11 billion, okay? That's expressed in current present-day dollars.
And let me be clear, and now it's $1 trillion. And Donald wants to chop it in half, and he gets my support.
Yeah, absolutely right. Well, and that $11 billion amounted to 0.9% of GDP, okay, not even 1%. Well, after Wilson plunged us into World War I, military spending soared, as you might expect, and amounted to $194 billion at the war's end. Or roughly 15% of GDP. But by 1924...
Hold on, let me stop you there. That's about 20 times, people.
Yeah, 20 times. It just ballooned, 20 times bigger because of the war, okay? But by 1924, this is like 5 years after the end of the war, 100% of troops came home, and military spending bottomed out at just $12 billion. Remember, that was only $1 billion more than in 1914, right? So, and actually it was a 0.8% of GDP. So as a percentage of GDP, we were spending less in 1924 than in 1914, just 10 years earlier. So we had this huge blip, right? We ballooned to spend 20 times more than we had, but then we brought it back down to what it was before World War I. Okay, this is important data. I had never read this data before, Sam, but this is very illuminating. I mean, if we did it then, we could do it now. and the world hasn't changed that much.
In fact, with a lot of our technology and everything else, I think we could do it easier now than it was to do then, Lowell.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the same thing, a similar thing happened at World War II. David Stockman goes into that. He talks about military spending skyrocketing when we entered World War II, but it dropped from $1.7 trillion in 1945 to just $125 billion by 1948. This, again, is in present-day dollars. And so look at that, 1.7 trillion in 45, back down to 125 billion in 48, just 3 years later. This is stunning data, Sam. But the war hawks were not content with that. They spun their tale of needing to bulk up militarily, lest the commies take down country after country, right? And this is the domino effect that we just mentioned earlier. And yet, Russia was never a threat to the United States following World War II, and NATO just laid the groundwork for the spread of a U.S. hegemonic regime. I mean, and that's what we have seen ever since. So David Stockman goes into great detail in his column, Sam, which is long but highly informative. But I want to skip toward the end where he outlines our current deterrence. This also is really quite interesting, talking about our current deterrence. The U.S. has 3,700 active nuclear warheads, of which about 1,800 are operational at any point in time. In turn, these are spread under the 7 seas in hardened silos and among a fleet of 66 strategic bombers, all beyond the detection or reach of any other nuclear power. See, that's pretty interesting. For instance, he says, the Ohio-class nuclear submarines each have 20 missile tubes, with each missile carrying an average of 4 to 5 warheads. That's 90 independently targetable warheads per boat. At any given time, 12 of the 14 Ohio-class nuclear subs are actively deployed and spread around the oceans of the planet within a firing range of 4,000 miles. So at the point of attack, that's 1,080 deep-sea nuclear warheads cruising along the ocean bottom that would need to be identified, located, and neutralized before any would-be nuclear attacker or blackmailer even gets started. Even Russia's vaunted hypersonic missiles couldn't find and take out by surprise the U.S. sea-based deterrent. And then there are roughly 300 nukes aboard the 66 strategic bombers, which are not sitting on a single airfield, Pearl Harbor style, waiting to be obliterated. They're constantly rotating in the air and on the move, end of quote. Well, am I happy about all of this military firepower? Well, not particularly. I'm happy because it's a deterrent. I'm not happy that it's out there, but I guess I'm glad that we have this deterrent. Now, Russia knows this, North Korea knows this, China knows this. That we have this huge deterrent force out there, and Stockman is making a point.
And that's why they haven't retaliated already, Lowell.
Exactly. So we can get out of NATO. We can drop the budget. We can cut it to $500 billion. Easy. That's just a fact. And Stockman goes into great detail about all the flesh and the bone that could also be cut. And it is the thing to do. I mean, Stockman needs to be part of DOGE. Ron Paul needs to be part of DOGE. Let's get the people who knows where the cuts can be made. Let's get them in touch.
Yeah, they need to create a DOGE board so that you can't just put all the attacks at Elon, and you can simply say, hey, you know what? Bright minds here's where the think tanks are leading, and here's why. And look, they're making the case to get out now, and boy, howdy, do I support that case big time. And I believe if we reduced our budget to $500 billion, I'd even like to go lower than that, but just say. And I think if we brought our troops home, I think would actually be more battle military ready for a real need than we are now, spread out thin around the globe.
And Stockman, by the way, this last comment from his article, I talked about his cutting the fat, the flesh, and finally the bone. He says the core component of America's military security requires only 7% of today's massive military budget, which we know is like $1.4 trillion. Only 7% of that is required for America's essential military security.
And what's that, $7 billion then?
Yeah.
If you say it's $1 trillion, it would be $7 billion. And we even talked about World War I. It was 11. What was it? Billion?
11 billion.
So they even had way too. They even had way too much then, right?
Yeah, 7% of $1 trillion is going to be 70 billion, right? Right? Because
10% would be 100 billion. Yeah. I'm sorry, 70 billion. Okay. So my point is to put that in perspective compared to the way it was before. It was like 11 billion. Now it'd be 70 billion. But Trump wants 500 billion. That's way off from $1 trillion. See, we've got to really push on this, folks. There's so much money we could save. But what they want to do is they want to save all the money over a 10-year period, which means, just so you know, every year there's a new Congress, a congressional session, right? Every 2 years, there's actually new congressional reps. Either you retain the same one or you get a new one, but it's a new guy every time. Same guy, 10 times, new guy each time, because it could have been somebody else. They're newly placed there, if you will. And you got to think about it that way, because that's how we don't have to push term limits, but yet we can have term limits at the same time, right? Just basically say, you're here fresh. We put you here again. You better in this 2 years do the same job we expect you to do last 2 years. And we need to look at rewarding them every time, or, hey, you're gone every time based on the 2-year stint. Right now, I'm not pleased with any congressman except for a couple, like Thomas Massie, or a couple of senators, Mike Lee, Rand Paul. For the most part, though, I'm not pleased with anybody in Congress, Lowell. Even people who I thought would do a great job. Just take Mike Kennedy. He's my local rep, freshly there. Been there for a couple of months. I like the guy. I think he's a great guy. But, man, I've called him and asked him to help me. So you've got Josh Hawley, senator in Missouri, who put a bill together to defund Planned Parenthood. So I called him and said, hey, Mike Kennedy, is there a companion bill in the House? He said, no. I said, will you create one? We'll get back to you. Haven't heard a word. Called several times, left messages. Can't get anybody on the phone. Can't talk to anybody. Can't get anybody back to me or whatever else. Okay, how pleased am I? And this is a no-brainer to defund Planned Parenthood. Now he's going to either vote for or against the budget coming up that I tried to get a companion bill in the House to push this discussion, but it's going to go nowhere, Lowell.
Yeah, and I'm pushing on Mike too. We just need to keep up the pressure. I mean, he should be a co-sponsor of Audit the Fed. He should be a co-sponsor of defund the Fed or end the Fed. He should be a co-sponsor of ending our relationship with NATO. So, but remember, politicians respond to pressure. So the more people who call them, the better. The more pressure they feel, and they do respond to pressure. Politicians are so predictable.
Maybe we need a whiskey rebellion, Lowell.
Yeah, that's right. I threw this article in here, Sam, at the tail end because it's a great lesson for us. The great whiskey rebellion, truth is the name of the column, noncompliance, resistance, and federal retreat. Because we were told this story when we went to the public government schools, and I swallowed that story hook, line, and sinker. And it's a lie about the whiskey rebellion. And what really happened is fascinating. And so I think Michael Bolden from the 10th Amendment Center.com comes out with this, the true history behind the whiskey rebellion. I mean, what we were told, what we learned in school was that there were some bunch of farmers that didn't want to pay a tax, and so they refused to pay the tax. And then George Washington, urged by Alexander Hamilton, personally led a massive military force into Pennsylvania and crushed the insurrection. That's what we learned in school. But that's a lie. That's a myth. And believing this myth is bad because it suggests that any resistance to federal authority is futile. That centralized power cannot be challenged. That's the myth. In reality, the whiskey rebellion was far from a quick federal victory. Instead, it was an 8-year saga of mass noncompliance that exposed the federal government's inability to enforce its own laws, and it eventually repealed the tax. Wow, that's not what I learned in public school. But Michael Bolden walks right through the facts and history here. He talks about North Carolina, where the resistance to the whiskey tax was immediate and intense. He talks about border counties in Virginia, hotbeds of anti-excise sentiment. In fact, a tax collector there named William McCleary received a letter warning that his property would be destroyed if he didn't resign. Well, he fled the country. He fled the county. Kentucky was the heart of mass resistance. Resignations among tax officials outpaced new appointments. Very few willing to enforce the unpopular law. And I love this fact, Sam. Quote, for 4 years, Kentucky's grand juries refused to bring any charges, even in the face of widespread, blatantly public non-compliance, end of quote. I point that out, Sam, because grand juries have the power, if they would simply use the power, they have the power not to bring charges, and they also have power to bring charges against people who are actual criminals. So
man, maybe we could do something like that with the IRS because Trump won't get rid of it.
Yeah. So, and so bottom line here of the story, Sam, is that no reputable lawyer wanted to be associated with enforcing the excise tax. You want to get run out of town, you try enforcing this excise tax on whiskey. And almost the entire population of Kentucky successfully resisted and defied the federal law for 8 full years, right? And so Congress backed down. They passed a law in 1792 that reduced the tax. Well, that wasn't good enough. Congress took another step backward in 1794, just 2 years later, further easing compliance requirements. That didn't do the job. So finally, in 1802, after 8 years later, Congress repealed the tax entirely. A clear admission of failure despite public claims of federal power crushing the opposition. What lessons can we learn from this, Sam? Well, this story is not about federal dominance. It's about successful resistance through noncompliance and nullification.
And this story really isn't even about whiskey at this point. I'm not really a fan of whiskey or whatever, right? But this is about, we just want to be left alone, Lowell. This is about people making their own choices, about local autonomy, about jurisdictional boundaries. I mean, the list goes on and on. It's about nullifying now. It's all kind of those things, right?
Right. Yeah, powerful reminder, Sam. The liberty often hinges not on who's in Congress or who's in the legislature or who's the judge, but on individuals and communities willing to refuse compliance with unconstitutional or unjust laws. And that's the key, Sam. You and I both know we would not encourage noncompliance with just laws. We only encourage noncompliance for unjust laws. So if it's not lawful, right, if it's not in alignment with God's law, then it's unjust, it's immoral, and those are the ones we really need to nullify. Sam?
I just want to say about this, I'm not really into rebellions. And so, sadly, the victors usually get to kind of, write the history, right? But the fact is, in my mind, the people that were rebelling was the government. When the government literally created this, belligerent, out-of-control tax or whatever else they did, right? Noncompliance, resistance is the answer. North Carolina set the example on this thing here. In North Carolina, resistance to the Whiskey Rebellion, then the tax was immediate. Intense. They said that it would be unenforceable in the frontier, and we think that turned out to be the facts, right?
Yeah.
Congressman John, how do you say his name? Sevier?
I think so.
Or Sevier? Anyway,
Sevier, probably.
This guy, he predicted it, and he's right. So I don't want to really promote any out-of-bounds resistance or breaking the law. But at the same time, we got to think, hey, the Constitution is sacred. But the Constitution without the Declaration of Independence doesn't have a whole lot of validity, right? You got to put the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution together and look at its holistic reality about free people and about the right to be left alone and about jurisdictional boundaries and about who has what authority. And really, that's something that people need to understand too, Lowell, speaking of this point about the Constitution, right?
Yeah, because power is divided among jurisdictions, right? The state has its jurisdiction, the counties, the sheriffs in the counties have their jurisdiction. And so you don't want to be out there alone, man, just, nullifying or non-complying with everything. But you get your local sheriff involved, and then you have some weight to throw around. Then you have real resistance there.
Yeah, and you get your county commission involved or your state legislative bodies involved, and you get some of these other branches of government. Before you know it, it becomes a trifecta for solutions. We need to remember with the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution working together, the reason you can't leave the Declaration of Independence out is because the Declaration of Independence documents before God and a candid world that, hey, we, the people, have the authority under God Almighty. That's something that is getting lost if we're not careful. Final word to you, Lowell.
Well, and that's right, Sam. I just really appreciate the example of these framing era patriots who successfully resisted an unconstitutional law and got it repealed. It took them 8 years, but they resisted and they got it repealed. We can do the same for unconstitutional laws today if we would simply, put some elbow grease into it, decide what's important, and go after it. So
thank you, Lowell. Got to nullify now. CampaignForLiberty.org. This broadcast is brought to you by LovingLiberty.net, our nationally syndicated radio leader. LovingLiberty.net. Spread the word, get involved, share the love, and God save our republic.